we hit on it a little bit ago before you gave that example.
Okay.
About fact and truth,
Mm-hmm.
and saying that something's story or myth doesn't necessarily discount the fact that it's true.
Yeah, yeah.
And
maybe not the fact that it's true, but like the presence of the truth.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, and maybe this is a whole nother episode because I don't want to jump into like all the things in Genesis.
Yeah.
Like we can discuss those later. But the point being that I think we've made them just to like give summary. And I guess if you all want to hear more about this, please let us know. We'll take a deeper dive into these things. But to say that to have a purely scientific mindset on it and to say, well, if it is this way, then it has to be fact.
Mm-hmm.
I won't say true. It has to be fact. It has to be observable fact in the scientific manner of you have the hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, you see the results, and then you fix your hypothesis, you come up with a new one, and then you go through it again.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We all learn that in like 3rd, 4th, 5th grade when we do science experiments.
Mm-hmm.
So we're trained in the scientific model, which again isn't bad, but it forgoes this whole mindset of like truth can come even from things that aren't observable fact.
Right.
So like in the whole argument of, and people across the spectrum of what they believe in the first stories in Genesis have different views on this. So like I'm not advocating for either one hard position or the other, but even within that there's debates about, well, is it a literal 7 24-hour days? Is it like thousands of years?
Mm-hmm.
What's the time span? All of that. Is there old Earth? Is it young Earth? Like all those things can be very like debatable.
Mm-hmm.
But I would even say like to begin the discussion there is just to start missing the point.
Right. And like the insistence on fact, like the insistence on like having to know something is antithetical to belief or faith,
mm-hmm.
because those things require that you don't know,
mm-hmm.
but you act as though they are
yeah.
like completely true.
Yeah. And this goes back to something I've heard Jeremy say more than once. It's like, don't you know that like the fact that something is true means that it's going to cause you to have more questions, not necessarily that it's going to hand you all the answers. So again, like I go to the things in like the creation story because it's like vital that we begin to understand those things
mm-hmm.
and like actually wrestle with them. But I think in the same way to like want to just, and I said this to Will, we were talking about like Genesis and like Job and all this other stuff and like wrestling through a lot of these things, and I just had this moment and I said, I think we've been trying to shove the Bible in a box and ask questions of it that
aren't fair,
right? Because going back to, bro, the Easterners not concerned about like, oh, was it a literal like 24-hour day? No, it's the poetic rhythm of the story.
mm-hmm.
That's the point.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like going up to Jesus after he tells the parable of the prodigal son and saying, oh, so that guy with those kids you talked about, like what town did he live in?
Mm-hmm.
Like what were his sons' names? And Jesus would look at you and go, that's not the point. But again, as I've been talking to other people in my life, like who, like my buddy who like I'm mentoring, and like he's like going to Wichita State to like become an engineer, and like he's very mathematical, like fact-minded,
mm-hmm.
and he's like really wrestling with this. And what I've been saying to him is like, okay, fact and truth, like as John was talking about, like myth and story doesn't mean that it's less true, even though it's not necessarily fact, because fact speaks to us in a different way. Right. So fact is true.
That's why we like analogies.
Yeah, and then there's this other subset of true, and so like I've used this as like, okay, so you asked Jesus, like, is that story true of the man with those sons? Is it true?
I'd say yes, it's true.
Yes. Okay, what do you mean by true? Right?
Well, that's where the conversation begins.
Yeah, that's where the conversation begins. And so we have to start understanding in this mix of Eastern and Western thought of like truth operating on different levels,
mm-hmm.
and not just being, okay, observable fact equals true,
mm-hmm.
and like if I can't like reproduce it in the physical world, not true.
Right.
Because we don't believe that in how we live our lives anyway.
Right.
Like,
And that like brings me to another example is that like since like truth requires like faithfulness, we can extrapolate, this, scientific like way of thinking out,
by the way, we've only really been thinking like that as a race for 500 years, maybe 1,000.
Like as like a civilization.
Yeah, like we've only really had that scientific model in
Right.
thought for not very long.
Right. And ironically, like those.
So to say that's sorry, but like my point is to say that like that's what true is
kind of superficial.
Yeah.
And it's like kind of ironic because those like early scientific beginnings in the West like began with members of the Catholic Church. But as I was saying, like if we wanted to extrapolate this mindset, this way of thinking out way wide, I would say that like in order to live your life, you have to like faith is required, like no matter like how big or small. So the ranch where we're recording this has like creaky wooden floors. Now, if you insisted that things should be looked at a scientific fact-based metric all the time, then why don't you measure like the tensile strength of each like floorboard, or test like the age and like to see how strong each floorboard is so that it doesn't like fall beneath your every step? Or like every normal person, you can walk across the floor and think nothing of it because that you trust that you have faith that it won't fall beneath you. But those are things that we never think about. But if you like observe that, it like requires faith to walk across the floor. If we were that scientifically minded, we would have to test like everything before we do it and hope that it work out. So it's okay to not know.
Yeah. And it's okay to be okay with the journey and not knowing. And I guess when I heard like, man, when the Easterner comes to something they don't understand, they rejoice because it's more buried treasure. And in terms of the whole scope of these conversations we want to have, it's in this areas of deconstructing, reconstructing, understanding that takes time, and being okay with that, and being able to know and trust, like you said, like trust the story, like have faith, like be okay with, hey, I'm not going to be able to wrap my mind around everything, nor should I be able to. Right? Like Jesus said, like I tell these things because they're confusing, so that the people who actually want to search them out will search them out. Those who have ears, let them hear. And then to just act like, thank you, Braden, to just act like, oh, well, it's not real if I can't understand all of it is really dumb. So, and understanding that blending this Eastern-Western thought is going to bring maybe even more confusion, but hopefully at the end it brings a lot more rest in knowing that, man, there's a reason for all the stories, and the stories speak at a different level than just pure fact. Back to the example with Jesus and the lawyer, right? Like, okay, here's the truth. Following me and being in the kingdom is loving God and loving others, and loving your neighbor. Well, what does that look like? Here's a story. Right. And the fact is, the more you meditate on the story, the more you understand it, the more you grasp it. The realer, is that a word? The more real that truth then reveals itself. And I guess the point is just in having both of these, understanding that it's okay to sit and wrestle through the stories.
Yeah.
For the truth and not just for the fact.
Yeah, absolutely.